All right. Hello, everybody. Today's speaker is Larry Walker. Larry, if you didn't know it, is Pam's, our docent council president, is her husband. Pam and Larry have been married for 37 years and have two sons. They both enjoy camping and traveling in their RV, exploring the West. Pam and Larry met originally at Lake Hullahontan through mutual friends. Larry, I don't know if you know this, but Pam told me. Larry is a member of the American Mountain Men and is keenly interested in the history of the Western fur trade era, shooting sports and rifles. Today, he will talk about the Beaver fur trappers the Beaver trappers of the fur trade era and how their particular skills and expertise live on till today. Fellow docents and friends, I introduce you to Larry Walker.
Well, good morning, everybody. I have a disclaimer to start with, and that is that I am not a historian. I'm simply a student of the history of the Western expansion of North America. So if there's a few little mistakes in my presentation, don't hold it against Pam. Anyway, we're going to look at the first Euro-Americans to explore the Great Basin. And actually, this exploration is really the tail end of a much bigger story, and that is what is popularly known as the fur trade era of North America, which basically runs from 1800 to 1840, maybe 1850. But it's the trapping of the Missouri after the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so why were they there? They were here because of the high value of pelts, in particular the beaver, whose fur was used in the making of hats since the early 1300s. And beaver had been trapped into extinction in Europe by the early 1600s and was being trapped in North America from about 1535 by the French. From about 1600 to 1850, an average of 100,000 pelts were annually being taken from North America. And the English Hudson's Bay Company dominated the trade in northern Canada and in the Oregon territories. In 1810, John Jacob Astor, an American, set up Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River, which later he sold to the Northwest Company out of fears of the upcoming War of 1812. The Northwest Company was eventually merged with the HBC. The first man credited with crossing the Great Basin is Jed Smith. In 1826, he left the rendezvous in Cache Valley, leading a group of 15 men down the Virgin River along the Sietskadee, or the Green, into the Colorado, to the Mojave Indian villages. And from there, he traveled west across the Mojave Desert and then across the San Bernardino Mountains to the Mexican mission at San Gabriel. After having problems with the Spanish governor, who thought they were spies sent to spy on what was going on in California, he told them they had to leave by the route they came from, which he did not do. He traveled north along the west flank of the Sierra Nevadas. And he was seeking the Rio Buenaventura. And it was long rumored to be a river that ran from the Great Salt Lake to the Pacific Ocean and dumped out around San Francisco. Anyway, he left all but two of his men, and they camped along the Stanislaus River. And he and his two companions crossed the snowbound Sierras to join his business partners at the 1827 rendezvous at the south end of Bear Lake in what is now Utah. His route back across the Great Basin followed pretty closely to what is now Highway 50, and then he veered north up by the Great Salt Lake. Anyway, he got back to the rendezvous at Bear Lake, which is in what is now Utah. And he left within 10 days and took basically the same route with an additional 18 men. Well, by the time he got down to the Mojave Indians again, in the meantime, between his first and his second trip, they'd had a run-in with a trapper out of Santa Fe by the name of Ewing Young. And there had been a scrap and some people killed. And so when he got half his men across the river, being Jed Smith, the Mojaves attacked, and I believe they killed 10 of his group. The men of the Hudson's Bay Company, in particular Peter Skeen Ogden and later John Work, they were probably the first to capitalize on trapping in Nevada, and in particular the Humboldt River and its tributaries. In 1828 and 29, they led an expedition into the Great Basin from the north, and came in around Winnemucca, what is now Winnemucca, and found the Marys River, or the Unknown River. And that's a whole talk in itself, all the different names that what became the Humboldt was used. And they trapped there. And the Hudson's Bay Company had Sandwich Islanders with them. And on one incident, 3 Sandwich Islanders were sent south out of Idaho to explore a river, and they never turned up again. It's believed they were killed by Indians. But the river was named the Oahe, and we have the Oahe Desert, which was kind of an American bastardization of what the Sandwich Islanders called their homeland, or Hawaii. And they were called Kanakas, which is the Hawaiian word for workers. John Jacob Astor was the first trader to bring Kanakas to North America because they were good paddlers and good swimmers. And his original business plan was to set up trading posts up the Columbia, and then have ships moving up and down the Pacific coast. And so he wanted good swimmers and paddlers. Milton Sublette was another to travel down the Oahe River into the Humboldt. And Joseph Meek was with him. And they ran into a real problem because the beaver along the Humboldt, this was later, had eaten most of the willow. So they'd been feeding on parsnip, wild parsnip. Well, that made their flesh poisonous. And because of the lack of game along the Humboldt, the trappers were forced to eat the beaver meat, and they became very sick. Joe Meek tells a story of sticking his hand in an anthill and waiting for the ants to cover his hand and then licking the ants off of his hand just for some protein. In 1833, Joseph Walker was put in command of a party sent by Benjamin Bonneville to the Great Salt Lake. And he was to find a land, or preferably a water route, again, the Buenaventura, to California. His clerk, Zenas Leonard, described the Humboldt and the people there as barren. And he named the river the Barren River. And I'm a member of the Barren River Party of the American Mountain Men. They traveled along the Humboldt to its sink, and from there to present-day Genoa, and ascended the Sierras along the West Fork of the Carson River. On their return from California, they crossed the mountains further south near present-day Tehachapi, and then up to Owens Valley. They tried to head east, but after finding it difficult to find water, they went backtracked, and then continued north up to the Humboldt Sink to return by their previous route. In 1840, Walker and his band made the first north-south crossing of the Great Basin to the Virgin River, then to the Colorado, and then across the Mojave to LA, where he was trading for horses. In 1843, he led the first wagon train to California by his previous route along the Humboldt, and to the sink, and that became the California Trail. He then traveled south to Owens Lake, where they were forced to abandon their wagons, and they went across the southern Sierra Nevada, eventually to the Salinas Valley. There's a guy who shows up all the time in the history of the fur trade from the very early days, about 1809, by the name of Caleb Greenwood, or Old Greenwood. In 1844, at the age of 81, Greenwood guided the Stevens Townsend Murphy party across the Sierras at what is now Donner Pass. And these were the first wagons ever to cross the Sierra Nevada. Now, James Beckwourth, he was kind of a notorious mountain man. There's an autobiography, but it was actually, he told it to, I can't remember the author's name now, and she wrote it all down. He was known as a gaudy liar. He was a great storyteller, and so his autobiography is to be read with a bag of salt. But an important man in the history of the fur trade. And in about 1851, he was headed towards California to get into the gold, mining thing. And he explored the Sierra between the Middle Fork of the Feather River and Truckee, and found a route that he thought would be better for wagons, and that's Beckwourth Pass, just north of us. And he set up a store in Sierra Valley where he would resupply pioneers coming west. Well, we can't leave out John C. Fremont and his guide, Kit Carson. They made 5 explorations to the west, the second of which in 1843-44 brought them into northern Nevada. And after successfully searching a trail to the Pacific via the Columbia River. And here they, quote, discovered Pyramid Lake. And while crossing the Sierras, following the river that Fremont later named for Carson, they were among the first Americans to see Lake Tahoe. Now, after traveling down through Central Valley of California, they picked up the trail blazed by Jed Smith and went back across the Mojave to the old Spanish Trail to Santa Fe. Now we're going to see a short film that was made by the National Geographic magazine. They were shooting an article for the magazine and attended a couple of camps put on by members of the American Mountain Men. And actually, we were barely aware that they were videotaping too, and some interviews. And I thought it was just for reference. Had no idea they were going to make this film, but so we'll show that now, Carol. Men went to the mountains to get rich. Probably more of them died than survived, and certainly more died than got rich. It was sort of the end of the discovery era of North America. Now he's living his later days. The traders are the ones that made the most money out of it. They were pathfinders. They were exploring new, uncharted territory. I'm a member of the AMM, American Mountain Men. The AMM is an invitation-only group. And I think what has drawn most of us to it is most of us started out going to Mountain Man rendezvous. The guys that moved on to the AMM were people that were more interested in really learning the day-to-day life. It was a full-time job surviving. Well, the AMM brings a wide variety of people from all walks of life to it, and they all bring something different.
Simplicity, the connection with the earth, the animals, the non-garbage, non-complicated, dependent on only yourself and your own skills. It's a freedom, a unique freedom.
you ask any of us what our most precious feeling that we have out here and on the trail is the feeling of pure freedom.
To have ridden as a mountain man over the plains.
It's interesting. It's just the common thirst for the knowledge of how they lived, and we all learn from one another. Things like just being warm, simple things that we take for granted today. They didn't write about that in their journals because they just assumed everybody knew how to make fire. The sort of Hollywood version of the lone trapper is not the mainstream. They trapped in brigades, and that was for survival. Most of these guys didn't get rich doing this. Most of them, by the time Rendezvous was over, they had spent everything they made.
These going for $4 to $6 a piece in the old days of Rendezvous. A good trapper would come in and be able to cash in for anywhere up to $1,000, $1,200 worth of goods. They did not exchange money. They were exchanging this and bartering for goods that were brought out from St. Louis.
And it was the finest felt for making hats, and it was very fashionable, and it was very profitable. The technology of the day is one of the things that fascinates me. The tools that they made that are, by today's standards, very crude, they were able to turn out precision working parts. One thing that a lot of people may not realize is mountain men didn't have ammunition. When you went to trade, you trade for raw materials. You could get your powder and you could get lead. And then you would have a ladle and you would heat the lead over your campfire and melt it and then pour it into the ladle. And that's called running ball.
We're living a vestige of American history through our eyes. We're reliving it and hopefully bringing it alive for people in today's world in a way that perhaps they're not taught in school because it's not written about exactly the way it was.
Be the last of the last.
Hell, I was there and I know so were you.
Very good, very good.
As it said in the little film, I'm a member of the American Mountain Men, and the slide up on the screen right now is basically our objectives and our code. This is an invitation-only group, and what we do is we go out in the wilderness and hunt and trap and camp as the original mountaineers did, with tools and equipment of the 1800 to 1840 period. So this requires research on our part from primary source journals, paintings, manifests from the trading companies. And there's relatively few journals from the day, first-person journals. But more information is turning up all the time, along with some of the manifests and that are being uncovered by historians. And so these manifests help give us a pretty good idea, or a very good idea, of the trade goods and equipment that left St. Louis for the upper Missouri trade. And so we use that a lot, and also paintings by Alfred Jacob Miller. He's the only artist ever to actually go to a rendezvous. Now, most of us were recruited from a modern day buckskinning rendezvous. And these are a family-oriented, they're camps, trade fair, black powder shooting events, archery events. And they're a loose interpretation of the original Mountain Man Rendezvous. The Mountain Man Rendezvous of the Upper Missouri were started by William Ashley, and he formed the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. And his first forays into the mountains, there was always a problem getting the furs back to market. And rather than having trappers travel all the way back to St. Louis to resupply and get trade goods, he came up with the rendezvous system where men would stay in the mountains for a couple of years. They would winter up there, and that way they would be there for the fall and the spring hunt when the pelts were the best. and Ashley would transport all the peltries back to St. Louis and sell them. Well, he figured out also that that's where the money was. It wasn't up there trapping, it was being the supplier. Okay, now here's a couple of pictures of some of the equipment. Everything you see here was made by myself and other members of the American Mountain Men. On the left, you see some different guns that we've built, powder horns. I think there's a bait bottle and a bullet bag on the left. On the right, there's a hooped beaver pelt. That white thing in the middle is a beaver skull. Just to the right of that is a hand-forged beaver trap that's been copied after an original, and then a knife, and there's probably a ball mold in there. The original fur companies, they weren't licensed to trap. They were licensed to trade with the Indians and not trap. But it was quickly evident that the tribes weren't going to supply enough pelts to meet the demand. So trapping brigades were formed. And these brigades had a loose military-like structure of 100 or more men. And they were broken down into parties. And the parties would go out in different directions and trap different streams and tributaries. And then within the parties, there'd be messes. And a mess would be 3 or 4 guys that would camp together and cook together and sleep together. In all this, you had a captain or bourgeois, and there's the American bastardization of that was a bourgeois. He was in charge of things either at a fort or if they were out in the field, the term was partisan. And he ran everything. He sent the parties out in different directions, and he was like a military leader. He had to organize everything. And then you also had a clerk, and the clerk was probably the second most important man in the brigade. You might have more than one clerk because, well, they kept the books and the ledgers, and sometimes they ran the trade meetings with the Indians. But they kept the ledgers of all the trade goods that were brought and each individual's account, because the trappers would trade for pelts, as you learned in the film, not for money. And a trapper may be an engagee who's employed by the company or even under almost a slave agreement where they had to work for them for 5 years, and where they were supplied with the traps, food, horse, and a yearly wage. Rarely did the wage pay them enough where they could sort of escape from this lifestyle. Sort of the top of the line was a free trapper, and he's one who had all his own gear and sold his pelts to the highest bidder. But he often traveled with one of the brigades just for safety reasons, or with a group of other free trappers. And also you had hunters that might double as trappers. They were to supply food for the brigade or for a fort. Camp keepers, they were kind of the bottom of the barrel. Their job was to pack everything up, move it, skin the beaver, stretch the hides, handle all that. The trappers just trapped. And then you had a blacksmith too. Here's just a couple of pictures of hunting. This is a guy who, on the left, Brad Bailey, took a deer with a rifle I built for him. And on the right, I'm just skinning out a deer that I took. Oh. And this is just a picture of a party of men on horseback. This was up in the Jarbidge Wilderness area, actually just this last summer. Now we have a slide of about trapping beaver. So the process of trapping beaver, the first thing is finding sign. Well, obviously a dam is a pretty good sign that there's beaver, or a lodge. But you're not always looking for that because like in the Truckee River, the beaver there don't dam up the river. And by the way, beaver are not indigenous to the Truckee River. They were planted there back in the 1920s. Guys thought it would be a great idea to have a beaver market, and they've done a great deal of damage to the trees along the Truckee River. But anyway, so what you do is you look for a sign along a place like the Truckee. You look for chewed willow branches, or a food raft, which is just willow branches that have been stuck in the bottom, so they can come back when things ice over and get them. The picture in the lower left shows a slide where the beaver's been going in and out of the water. And you can see a trap there set in the shallow water. That trap has a chain on it. That chain goes out into deeper water where it's staked down. And also you'll notice along the edges of the trap, there's sticks have been driven in. That's to sort of guide the beaver onto the trap. Now, a beaver will often make what is called a scent mound, where he puts some of his own castor scent. He's marking his territory. So the way you get to bring him to trap is if you have your bait, which is made from the castor gland and the oil gland of the beaver. And sometimes they'd mix a little rum in there or some nutmeg just to make it more aromatic. And you dip a stick in that bait, and you stick that on the scent mound or on the slide. So the beaver will come up and stand to sniff it because he wants to see who's been invading his territory. He steps in that trap. Trap grabs his leg. He swims for deep water because that's where safety is. And the weight of the trap drowns him. And that was the old traditional way of trapping beaver. And you can do a dam set where you break a hole in the dam, and the beaver will come to repair that hole, and you could do a set in a place like that too to catch them. Next thing is you skin the beaver and stretch the hide or hoop it. And here's a hooped beaver hide. And the illustration on the right is of a press for packing the pelts. You would fold the pelts hair into a square and compress them in a press like this, and then wrap them with rawhide. And then that way, that's how you would transport them. Transportation would be by bull boat, canoe, or by horse. And then if you could get them to the river where there's a keel boat, that's the most efficient way. This particular keel boat in the picture here was built by members of the, one member of the AMM back in 2019. And what these guys did was they retraced William Ashley's trip from the first rendezvous in 1825. They went by horse for 350 miles and then 100 to 200 miles along the Sweetwater River and the Yellowstone River down to the Missouri River, where they met up with this keel boat and traveled down the Missouri. They didn't go all the way to St. Louis because there's dams and all kinds of obstructions. And it turned out that in 2019, the river was in flood while this trip was being done. So it turned out to be a pretty dangerous undertaking because the river was so high. Whenever they try and go to the bank, they had to take the mast down and use grappling hooks, and the river was moving quickly, and it was a pretty scary deal. But nobody got hurt. Everybody made it. Okay, here you see a bull boat. Bull boat was basically just a framework made out of willows or saplings, something that was flexible that they could tie together, covered with the skin of a buffalo, a bull hide. The illustration on the left is of Indians using them, and the mountain men use them for river crossings. River crossings probably accounted for half of the deaths of the mountain men. Now, paddling one of these things is kind of a challenge because it's like being in a teacup. So they don't like to track very well. But sometimes they were made, and members of the American Mountain have made long cigar-shaped ones, more like a canoe. And you can actually carry a lot of gear in that. typically your camp would have been just an open camp, like you see on the right here, where you just roll out your bedroll with your feet to the fire. And, as long as the weather's good. In inclement weather, you would set up a lean-to, or what we call a diamond shelter, just a piece of canvas to keep the rain or snow or dew off of you. If you're in scary country, as far as grizzly bears or marauding Indians, very often they would sleep in a wheel around the fire with your feet to the fire, and everybody's facing out away from the fire. That way you can sleep with your gun loaded. And so if something happens in the middle of the night, you're not going to shoot across the fire and shoot your buddy. The picture on the left, I'm sorry, was a winter camp. And in the winter, they would build kind of a rude cabin or lean-to. You can see here he's got all his traps hung up, some hides hung up. And so that way they could stay warmer. But you'd need something a little more substantial for the winter, but it wasn't fancy by any means. Not a cabin like we think of a cabin these days. Okay, there's no matches, so fires are all started with flint and steel or a bow drill. Cooking was done over an open fire. In a mess, you'd probably have a pot, cast iron pot, or a tin pot, a skillet. You'd use a tripod very often, or make some sort of a grill that you could roast meat on. Their diet was predominantly meat, buffalo being the favorite. But whenever they could find fruit, berries, edible plants, the Indians, a lot of the Indians grew squashes and melons. So you'd have that. Pemmican, which we've all heard of, was basically dried buffalo meat that had been ground up, mixed with some tallow or lard, and whatever berries might be available. I've had what has been described as really good pemmican, and it's just survival food. It's edible and appealing are two different things. Okay, now here's a tripod, a grill with fish being cooked on over it. The upper left picture, I think, that was buffalo heart, which was really good. And over the tripod is hanging a beaver tail. I have had beaver tail when it was good, but it usually tastes like butt. During trapping season, there wasn't much in the way of leisure time. Maybe smoke a pipe around the campfire in the evening. Your leisure time would have been during rendezvous, which turned into kind of a raucous party. There was shooting events or competitions and horse riding, and everybody bragging about how they were the biggest, toughest mountain man around. But during the winter time, there would be you would be repairing your saddles, your horse gear, you're collecting firewood, and you'd be repairing traps and whatnot. But they had what they called Rocky Mountain colleges, where those that could read might read Shakespeare or the Bible, or whatever was in print in the day. A big part of the AMM is education. It's an important part of what we do. And we have people in all over the country and in Sweden and Denmark. But different parties will engage in public displays, lectures, and demonstrations. This picture here is of a demonstration at the La Purisma Mission, just in Lompoc, California, where every year in March, the state park has members of the AMM come down and do an encampment at the mission, and they bring in 1,000 fourth graders to tour it, and because they're learning about the missions at that time. So on the left here, Don Morgan is telling kids about the beaver hats. The middle picture is my friend Gary Brown. He's showing them blacksmithing skills. He's an incredible blacksmith. And then on the right, Larry Huber is showing some tourists how a firearm works. Probably our most ambitious work is being done at the Museum of the Mountain Man in Pinedale, Wyoming. I highly recommend a visit there if you find yourself in the neighborhood. It's a wonderful museum. And every year, Pinedale has what they call a rendezvous or Mountain Man Days, and it goes on for a weekend. Well, during that time, members of the American Mountain Men go and set up a camp adjacent to the museum to show people how we go out and camp. Everything of ours has to be documentable, down to the clothing, the fabrics used. Everything has to be hand sewn. The buckskins are preferably from deer that we've shot with our flintlock, and tanned in the way of the Plains Indians by brain tanning. So anyway, that's the end of that. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take those. This was one of my first horse trips in the Tetons.
Do all the men in your group have nicknames? Is your nickname Long Arm?
Yes, it is. And not everybody has a nickname, but a lot of them do. Usually you get your nickname by doing something stupid. Mine just came from, I was throwing a tomahawk one day and a guy goes, "Man, you got a long arm," and it stuck.
Okay.
But there's one guy in particular, his name is Six Lips because he's got a big enough mouth for 3 people. So it goes like that. One guy's name is Spirit Horse Hunter because he lost a horse. So it's just things like that.
How do you know today if beaver meat is poisonous, and does wild parsley poison other animals in nature?
That I don't know. The beaver, well, they were trapped out of the Humboldt, but they also kind of put themselves out of business by eating up the food and cutting down all the trees.
Yep.
No, it was not wild parsley, it's wild parsnip.
Parsnip, thank you.
Yeah, that they were eating. And so I don't know. The only beaver meat that I've eaten has been taken out of the Truckee River, and as far as I know, there's plenty of willow for them. That's their preferred eating.
Okay.
Their preferred food source.
I had a question about the guy. Looks like he had a tin can on a rope and he was swinging it around.
It was Larry.
That was me. Well, in the film, you may recall there was a skillet with beans in it. So we were roasting beans. And then they didn't have all the pictures in order, but then you put the beans in a bag and smash them up with your tomahawk and get them as finely beat up as you can and just throw them in a pot full of water. So having a mustache is real good to help filter out all the chunks. But I'll swing around a pot to help settle the beans. You hit it with a little cold water and that helps drop them to the bottom so you don't get so many. But you want to make sure that your pail has really good bale on it before you do that.
So your beans were green.
Yeah, but we'll carry green beans in the field with it.
Interesting.
They'll keep for years.
Larry, you said that the American Mountain Men, you have to be invited to join. What is the qualifications to be invited?
Well, like I said, usually we're recruited from buckskinning groups. And if, as members of the American Mountain Men, if we see somebody that shows us something as far as their primitive skills, and we may invite them to join. And then they have to come camping with us to see if they're a fit with the group, and see if we're a fit for them too, if it's something they want to do. Because it's really it takes about 2 years, because to become a full member, you have a series of requirements you have to do. It's like having one complete set of handmade clothes and equipment, spending a certain number of days in a primitive camp with no more than one other person. Different requirements are like doing a research paper, going out for 3 days with no food and water, and living from the land, shooting a big game animal with your flintlock and field dressing it, learning how to pack a man, canoe, or a horse for extended travel. And then certain trips, like 5 days of travel on horseback, canoe, or walking, covering as much ground as you can. So it's a big commitment to do it. And so not everybody makes it, and not everybody is cut out for it.
Do you have a long waiting list of people who want to join?
No, not at all.
No.
In fact, most of our one guy said that our membership goes up by 1 year every year, our average age, because it's mostly older guys that are interested in it. I mean, and you have to have a sponsor to join. You actually have to have 2 sponsors, or one of an advanced level. My oldest pilgrim was 74 when he started.
Gosh.
And he got 10 requirements done inside of a year.
Wow.
But he was very motivated and very skilled.
If these people are going out on their own doing this, who's evaluating?
Your sponsor is. What a big thing in the American Mountain Man is this code of ethics. And a man's word is his bond. If you can't trust a man to have done what he said he did, then you shouldn't be sponsoring him. Now, in that sponsoring process, when you're doing these requirements, you're supposed to keep a journal of everything you do, where you did it, who you were with, the dates. So it's all, you have to document everything you do.
Is there any documentation that literally documents that dogs were taken on these beaver excursions in the 1800s? I saw one photo with 4 dogs in it.
I can't, I don't recall any documentation of mountain men having dogs unless they were eating them.
Okay. Okay. We know Lewis and Clark took a dog with them, but
he had a Newfoundland named Siemens.
Yeah.
The Indians kept dogs because they used them for pulling travois, pulling camps, and food, and they usually had a lot of dogs. Mountain men didn't keep dogs as pets because starving times were kind of a norm. And so a dog wouldn't last long in starving times.
Thank you.
It was actually quite a delicacy.
Is there a market for beaver pelts today?
Nope.
Okay.
The beaver, now, for instance, this hat is beaver felt, but the beaver being used for hats, from what I understand now, most of it comes from Brazil and Argentina.
Ah.
And they introduced beaver down there for harvesting, and they're causing a hell of a problem with forests.
Are you required to own your own horses or mules? Do most of you do that?
There's no requirement to own a horse. A lot of guys do. When we have our national rendezvous, which is always held somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, there's a lot of groups that may travel in from 100 or more miles horseback. So they'll spend 4 or 5 days riding into the rendezvous. And not always on their own horses. Sometimes they'll have a big group and certain members will rent horses. But that very often turns into some sort of a horse wreck somewhere along the trail. A friend of mine who's led over 60 horse trips can recall one where nothing went wrong. The last horse trip that I went on, the horses broke their picket ropes, and all 5 of our stock 3 horses and 2 mules took off. And it wasn't until the next morning that we got them back.
And now I want to talk about smoking. Did you have to roll your own cigarettes? In the 1800s, tobacco was available?
Oh yeah, well, tobacco was one of their biggest trade items with the Indians.
Okay.
The Mandans grew tobacco, and I've had Mandan tobacco. They thought it was extinct, but some guys found some and grew it, and it's very mild. And so the Indians, they liked the trade tobacco because it was much stronger. There's tobacco that grows wild in the Sierras, and it's terrible. But rolling papers weren't out yet. So in that film, there's a couple of guys smoking rolled cigarettes.
Yeah.
That's not technically correct. Rolling papers were available, but we don't have any record of them going into the Rockies. Cigars were correct. They were brought, and then they would have carrots or twists of tobacco that they would bring along. The most common way of smoking was in a pipe, and it wasn't smoking like today. Smoking was something you did for a leisure thing in the evening. You might smoke a bowl of tobacco, and that would be about it. But it was a very, very big trade item with the Indians. In
one shot, you were loading a rifle at the tip of the rifle. I don't know what that's called.
Right.
But okay. And you were stuffing in something. Was that charred cloth?
Well, no. Well, the guns that they used were muzzle loaders. And that term muzzle loader is simply, it's loaded from the muzzle.
Okay.
So the barrel is basically a tube. You pour a measured amount of powder down that barrel, and then what you do is you put a patched round ball. And so that was just a piece of pillow ticking wrapped around the ball. And that's to grab the rifle and put a spin on the ball. And most of the fur trapping area were flintlocks, where the lock part of the gun has a flint in it, which scrapes a little bit of metal off of the frizzen, and that makes the spark, which ignites a little bit of powder that's actually on the outside of the barrel, and it flashes through a hole that ignites the main charge. And so if you watch movies like Last of the Mohicans, they're all shooting flintlocks, so you have that big flash right in front of the guy's face. There's a couple of neat little terms that you guys might recognize. Young people don't recognize these at all. A flash in the pan.
Yeah.
Okay. That comes from a flintlock rifle. If it sparks and flashes the pan but doesn't ignite the load inside the barrel, much ado about nothing. A flash in the pan. Lock, stock, and barrel. Those are 3 major parts of a gun. You don't go off half cocked. The gun has a half cock. It won't go off if you pull the trigger on half cock. So that's where those terms came from. Those are all from flintlock rifles.
So today, when you have a rendezvous, you have a variety of ways of communicating. You can get on the phone, you can send email. How did everybody come to the rendezvous at the same time?
Well, it was a predetermined meeting point, and there were certain spots that most of the mountain men knew of. that were nice gathering spots, because they had water and feed for your stock, things like that. The Green River Basin, right near Pinedale, Wyoming, is where Horse Creek comes into the Green River. There was 4 of the big rendezvous were held there. Bear Lake, there was 2 rendezvous held there. So there were places that most of these guys were familiar with, or at least the leaders of the parties or brigades were familiar with. And so, and they would be filtering in. The first rendezvous in 1825 only lasted for a day, and there was about 120 people there. But at the end, they would last for weeks. And as far as the traders, there was some competition there too. The first guy on site was usually going to do the best because he would get to pick the prime furs. But there would be lots of Indians and different. The Crow would show up once in a while, the Blackfeet, and that usually didn't turn out well. But as many as 1,000 people, individuals, could show up to a rendezvous in the later years. By 1840, it had dwindled down to nothing because silk hats came into style. So the demand for beaver wasn't much. The cost of trade goods had gone way up. So, I mean, it was a capitalist society. And so you had all these different financial things controlling the business.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
It
you.
was
Thank you.
fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Pam.
So
Very
thanks,
nice.
everybody. We'll